Hi guys, the lens that you are looking at right now has more than 5,000 five-star reviews, and according to Amazon US, this is the #1 rated lens and the #1 selling lens in the history of mirrorless lenses. And let me show you a side-by-side right now of why that is. One of these is shot with my A7 IV and an expensive G Master lens, totaling $3,900 USD. The other one is shot with my ZV-E10, the original version, and this top-rated lens coming in at a combined total of about $1,150. You can see why people seem to really dig this lens. And this is another one of the lenses right here because it comes in several mounts, including Sony E, Nikon Z, Fuji X, this one is micro four thirds, Canon M mount, and very soon, if you can believe it, the Canon R mount. Have you guessed it yet? A lot of you know what it is, but we still need to talk about it. So before I so dramatically reveal what this lens is, I want to tell you I have two goals for this video. The first one being to show you why this lens is so special and why it's been such a great seller for so many years. And the second one is to talk about the lenses that might now be in competition with this one, or perhaps even surpassed this wonderful, wonderful lens. And this wonderful lens that I'm talking about is, of course, the Sigma 16mm f1.4 for APS-C and micro four thirds. Here he is, the king of the hill, the best-selling APS-C lens of all time. But there are two lenses hot on the heels of this juggernaut Sigma 16mm. Here they are. We will talk about those in a bit. But first I want to mention why I love a 16mm so much for the APS-C system, because I do a lot of video. First of all, we'll talk about photos in a second, but I do a lot of video, and a lot of my video are YouTube type videos, talking head videos, and even when I'm doing other work for other people, a lot of it involves interview style content. And I like a 16mm because full frame field of view, it's about a 24. The camera isn't right up on your subject, but you still get a decent amount of the background. But I can lean over right now, touch the camera. Hopefully I didn't put a smudge on the lens, and I can touch the camera. I can manipulate my settings just by leaning over a little bit. It is just perfect for me for what I like to do. A 16mm focal length is also great for landscape photography and environmental photography. You really get a wide field of view, but it is not so ultra wide that it distorts your image, but you can still get a lot of the landscape in there. And the same thing goes for astrophotography. It is nice and wide for astrophotography, and to be able to go down to f1.4, let in all that light when you're in those low light situations, it is so great to have a 1.4. And of course, that 1.4 pays dividends in low light video as well. If I am going out shooting in the dark with my APS-C cameras, the Sigma 16mm 1.4 is an absolute standard for me. I love a 1.4 out in the nighttime. Now, you certainly can use this lens for vlogging to show everyone that you are an important YouTuber. I personally love the 11mm f1.8 from Sony when I'm talking about APS-C cameras because it's such a wide field of view, but you can get away with the 16mm. I would suggest using the gyro data that is being recorded to the SD card, stabilize that in Catalyst Browse. You get this gimbal-like footage, and you only have to do a 2-3% crop if you're moving at a pace like this. So that is what I would do, because if you're using active stabilization, you get something like this. This is a much tighter field of view here on the ZV-E10 because it crops in so much for that active stabilization. And I am still using a selfie stick that's extended out a bit further and still pretty tight. So we'll talk about this Sigma's amazing optics in just a second, but first let's take a look at the build quality, and it is dead simple. There are no buttons or switches or aperture rings. It is just a hard plastic lens with a smooth turning rubber ring for focus. It has some weather resistance, and it has a 67mm filter thread, which is a very common filter thread size right there on the front to attach your filters. It has a high quality petal lens hood, but really I leave the lens hood at home and I just stick on a little UV filter to protect the lens element to make the package a little smaller in my camera bag. I'll link all the filters I talk about and everything else in this video below in the description. There'll be affiliate links to make me stinking rich, of course. Now let's move on to the optics of this lens, and that is what's really important. What do you get when you stick this lens on your fancy cameras? And what you get is almost perfection coming out of this lens. There are a couple of flaws, and we'll talk about those, of course, but let's talk about the goodness first. The autofocus is fantastic. It's as good as any Sony lens. It is just quiet and responsive, and by quiet, I mean almost dead silent. So quick to snap focus to subjects, and there is no flutter, there is no hesitation. Even when you are down in extremely low light conditions, this lens has no trouble continuing to catch you with the autofocus. I couldn't be more impressed with this Sigma lens and autofocus. The coatings that Sigma uses on this lens are great. The colors just pop, and the flare control and the ghosting control is excellent as well when it comes to this Sigma 16. Sharpness is phenomenal. When it comes to a medium wide lens like this, you are getting such ridiculously sharp image right from the center to the corners. Wonderful sharpness on this Sigma lens. It is one of the favorite features for people when they get this lens, is to see how sharp the images are coming right out of it. Lateral chromatic aberration is excellently controlled on this lens, but when it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberration, that is where we see one of the flaws of this lens, because that is the areas out of focus. When you see color fringing on the areas out of focus before or after the plane of focus, that is longitudinal chromatic aberration, and you will definitely see that at f1.4 and in fact at f1.8, even at f2, you will see some loca. By the time you stop it down to f2.8, it's almost completely gone, and by f4, you don't see any hint of it at all. Now that is pretty standard at this focal length, but still, if you are stopping way down to f1.4, then the loca can rear its ugly head. The bokeh is so nice and smooth on this lens, and the bokeh balls as well are very impressive. A small amount of haloing around the bokeh balls, but nothing to complain about. There is almost no focus breathing on this lens, which is great news for people who want to shoot video and do long focus pulls, because you don't want to see that breathing, the frame move in and out when you're trying to do those focus pulls. It can be very distracting. Or if you're doing landscape photography, you want to do some focus stacking in post, you don't want the frame changing too much while you are changing your focus. And nothing to worry about here on the Sigma 16, a very impressive job of focus breathing control. Now this lens has been out since 2017 without much competition at all, but recently there have been a couple of competitors. One from Sony themselves and another one right here from Yongnuo. Now as you can see, they are both smaller lenses than the Sigma and they are lighter than the Sigma. And I think that is one of the other flaws of this Sigma lens. It is fairly big and heavy. And this Sony 15 is smaller and lighter and a little bit wider at 15 millimeters. It is another 1.4. Let's talk about that one first. Now the Sony lens is very on par with the Sigma lens in terms of optical quality. The Sony might be a tiny bit better when it comes to focus breathing, but as I say, the Sigma is almost perfect. The Sony is just perfect when it comes to that. Plus, you can use the focus breathing compensation in the Sony cameras to go along with this, although you really don't need it. And this Sony lens, it has an aperture ring, it has an autofocus to manual focus switch, and a focus hold button. So there are a lot of bells and whistles on this Sony lens, and if you can afford it, it is definitely a nice lens to have. It is one of the best APS-C lenses of all time, but it costs almost twice as much as this Sigma. I have compared these two lenses in a video and I will link that below, but suffice it to say, you can't go wrong with either of these two. So now let's look at the other competitor, and that is the Yongnuo 16mm f1.8. It's a 1.8, so it doesn't let in as much light. You won't get quite the background blur that you will get from this Sigma lens, but it is smaller and lighter, and it has an autofocus to manual focus switch and a focus hold button. It is a really well-built lens, and its autofocus is great. Its focus breathing is great, and surprisingly, it is a nice bit cheaper than this already great value Sigma 16mm f1.4. I have said many times this is the best value in mirrorless camera lenses right here, the Sigma 16mm f1.4. But I gotta say, the Yongnuo is giving it a run for its money because optically it's almost as good and it's a fair bit cheaper. But the Yongnuo lens is fairly new, so we have to see how it does hold up over time. We know this one right here, since 2017, Japanese craftsmanship, this lens has stood the test of time and people still love it to this day, and that's why I still recommend it very highly on this channel. Anyway, let me know down below if you own the Sigma 16mm f1.4 and what is the mount that you use it on. We'll have a nice little discussion about it. Hey, thanks for watching this. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.